And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called Remembrance, released in 1978. This is one of his best Blue Note albums. He performs on this album alongside his band The Jazz Machine. Many of the tunes in the album were original compositions that feature room for improvisation as they performed. Elvin completes the picture with some high-octane drumming. Merry-Go-Round was released in 1971. This one offers us a diverse range of songs and collaborating musicians. A large ensemble featuring both up-and-coming and veteran bandmates. There's an interesting setlist of songs, many of them original compositions by the band members. And Live at the Lighthouse, released in 1972. This one was recorded during Elvin Jones' 45th birthday as part of the celebrations. It offers us everything from blistering solos to dynamic interplay between saxophonists Dave Liebman and Steve Grossman. This was also a groundbreaking album in the hard bop repertoire. So that was a quick insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Remembrance, released in 1978. So Elvin Jones is one of the most innovative jazz drummers of his time. He set the trend for several drumming techniques that are still popular today. A good example is the album Remembrance from 1978, one of his best Blue Note albums. He performs on this album alongside his band The Jazz Machine. The music features some great originals like Familiar Ground, Little Lady, Section 8, Kalima and more. There was newcomer Pat LaBarbera on tenor and soprano saxophone. Roland Prince was the guitarist and he was great on the solos. Providing a beautiful foundation for Elvin's drumming was bassist Andy McLeod. Many of the tunes in the album were original compositions that feature room for improvisation as they performed. Elvin completes the picture with some high-powered drumming. Merry-Go-Round was released in 1971. This one offers us a diverse range of songs and collaborating musicians. A large ensemble featuring both up-and-coming and veteran bandmates like Frank Foster and Pepper Adams. Also, there were some newer players like Dave Liebman and Steve Grossman. There's an interesting setlist of songs, many of them original compositions by the band members. The music ranges from sensitive to dynamic. Round is a very soft piece by bassist Gene Perla. And there's Lungs, a very fiery piece by Jan Hammer. This trend of varying styles and tempos continues in a lovely flute song by Joe Farrell and a guest appearance by pianist Chick Corea on A Time for Love. Also, there's some great original compositions by Dave Liebman and Chick Corea. Overall, this album offers us an insight into Elvin's performances in various styles and settings. Live at the Lighthouse was released in 1972. This one's a completely different sort of album. It was recorded during Elvin Jones' 45th birthday as part of the celebrations. And it offers us everything from blistering solos to dynamic interplay between saxophonists Dave Liebman and Steve Grossman. Grossman and Liebman both had styles similar to Jones Coltranes. There's also Gene Perla on bass, holding the music together with sensitive and inventive playing. Elvin Jones plays very exuberantly on the opening track, Fancy Free by Donald Byrd. There's a composition from Liebman called New Breed featuring some great sax solos with gentle background drumming by Jones. And there's My Ship, a lovely flute melody supported by saxophone. One of the standout features is the mesmerizing performances of the two saxophonists, especially when they play simultaneously. This is also a groundbreaking album in the hard bop repertoire. So that was some insight into more of Elvin Jones' best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We are going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. Now it's time for some trending album news. Trending right now on the Jazz Albums chart for this week, a brilliant album by Jon Batiste called Beethoven Blues. Batiste is a celebrated jazz musician with 2 Grammy nominations to his credit. So Beethoven Blues is an album that finds blues in Beethoven's classics. According to Batiste, Beethoven's work taps into a universal connective magnetic truth in music that you would also hear in blues. He also believes that classical music has the potential to be transformed, to be remixed. And that's what this album is about, reimagining Beethoven's compositions with a blues twist. Basically, Batiste plays each classic from memory, improvising in between and reworking each song into a blues format. The results are very mesmerizing, very upbeat renditions of the classics. For instance, on the classic For release, he adds blues themes to the end of each phrase. Symphony No. 5 is portrayed in a barroom jazz style. Ode to Joy is reimagined as a gospel and R&B ballad. Also, the album compiles some of Batiste's own compositions, also inspired by his love of classical music, Dusklight Movement, American Symphony Theme, and Life of Ludwig. So this is a great album, both a tribute to the classical music maestro, also a testimonial to Jon Batiste's creative combination of classical and jazz landscapes to give a mesmerizing musical compilation. So that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Elvin Jones' best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashanti Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first one's called At This Point in Time, released in 1973. The music is all about fusing rock, jazz and avant-garde themes. The instrumentals comprise saxophone, piano, bass and percussion. Overall, it's a compilation of groove-oriented music. Also, a standard feature of this album was the use of the Moog synthesizer, which was just becoming popular at the time for its ability to merge an unlimited variety of sonic textures and tones into one. Very Rare was released in 1978. This album sees Elvin collaborating with saxophone legend Art Blakey on several of the tracks. Other tracks are taken from a live performance in Tokyo. There's some great solo and band performances here. In Europe was released in 1991. This album was recorded during a live performance in Germany. The band performed some of their signature tunes. Also, there's a lot of improvising and solo performances by the musicians. And an album called Revival, live at Pookie's Pub. This album was recorded shortly after Elvin's days with Coltrane, and his dynamic drumming style takes center stage on this album. In this album, we see his unique style on the drums. There's also some great original compositions by the bandmates on this album. So that was a quick insight into what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. During this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called At This Point in Time, released in 1973. This album sees Elvin in a rather unique setting. It's a groundbreaking compilation of music that sees Elvin Jones pushing boundaries with his innovations backed by a large ensemble. He blurs the boundaries between jazz, rock and avant-garde in the music. So this band comprises himself on drums, 3 saxophonists, a guitarist, a pianist, a bassist and 4 percussionists. The unique feature of the instrumentals was the use of rhythm boxes. This was a type of early drumming machine to increase the groove of the music. Another unique instrument, the Moog synthesizer, which was becoming popular in the 60s. This instrument gave the musicians a chance to experiment with combining an unlimited range of tones in their music. One example is on the song Quartet, which is memorable for the vast array of electronically generated sound effects. The song was an original composition by percussionist Omar Clay. Another funky upbeat track that used a Moog synthesizer, a Frank Foster composition called The United Nations, also featured a beautiful keyboard solo by Jan Hammer. Also, a beautiful Elvin Jones composition called Don't Cry featuring a nostalgic drum solo. Very Rare was released in 1978. The material on this album sees 2 different sessions. The first session sees Elvin leading a band comprising Art Pepper, Richard Davis and Roland Hanna. Basically on that session, he's soloing, backed by piano, bass and saxophone accompaniment. The second half of the album is taken from a live performance in Tokyo. At this point, Art Pepper was experimenting with incorporating Jones Coltrane's techniques into his saxophone playing, and the combined results are mesmerizing. Some of the outstanding tracks: his haunting take on The Witching Hour by Roland Hanna. There's another great duet that Elvin has with bassist Richard Davis on the song Peter Pat. A beautiful song called A Love Supreme, where Elvin and his band members stretch out for 26 minutes with a very dynamic rendition of the original classic. In Europe was released in 1991. This was another great live performance alongside his band The Jazz Machine. This album release came shortly after Jones had completed a 1-year tour of the world. It was recorded during a live festival in 1991 in Germany. Also features John Coltrane's son Robbie Coltrane as guest saxophonist. There's 3 great original compositions from the band members featuring some neat improvisation. There's a beautiful rendition of a Japanese folk song called Doll of the Bride. The song opens up with a rollicking flute intro by Sonny Fortune, then Elvin picks up the pace with a gentle drum rhythm. And then there's a piano solo followed by 2 saxophone solos. Robbie Coltrane is great on the McCall-Tyner composition Island Birdie, a calypso type track. Another great flute solo by Sonny Fortune, the composition Ray L, a composition by Elvin's brother Thad Jones. This one's a medium-tempo blues tune. And Revival, live at Pookie's Pub. This was another great live album recorded in 1967. The performance was held as a tribute to the great John Coltrane, who had passed away 2 weeks earlier. John Coltrane was one of Elvin's inspirations. He played alongside him from 1996 to 1966. One of the standout performances in this band comes from saxophonist Joe Farrell, who was a rising star. Also, Jones himself is in top form. This recording went undiscovered for several years until it was unearthed by jazz researcher Zeb Feldman many years after it was recorded. He'd also previously discovered great albums like Lee Morgan's Live at the Lighthouse, released on Blue Note Records in 2021, and Albert Eiler's Revelations, the complete ORTF, released in 1970. So like his previous projects, this one comes with an extensive introductory booklet detailing events and facts and figures about the performance and the musicians collaborating. The booklet includes interviews and statements by the musicians, people like Alvin Queen, Richie Berriac, Gene Perla and others. So in Revival, 2 of the standout tracks, 2 great flute solos on 2 great classics, My Funny Valentine and Softly as in a Morning Sunrise. There's also a lovely piano rendition on the song Gingerbread Boy by Jimmy Hart. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Elvin Jones, his life and times and best hits. We've come to an end of this week's episode of the Jazz Update, so now it's time to recap what we were discussing during this program. Elvin Jones is one of the pioneers of jazz drumming in the 60s. His style was characterized by his dynamic accompaniments, innovative play and propulsive flow, traits that bridge the gap between bop, modal jazz and avant-garde jazz. He went on to influence several other jazz musicians like John Bonham and Ginger Baker. Much of this became apparent during his day with Coltrane, with whom he toured and performed from 1960 to 1966, recording several hit albums like A Love Supreme, My Favorite Things and Live at Birdland. Even before he joined John Coltrane's band, he'd already made a name for himself alongside his brothers Hank and Ted, also collaborating on albums alongside Miles Davis, Sonny Rollins and others. He also had notable collaborations with artists like Wayne Shorter and Joe Henderson. He started out making a name for himself with Coltrane's group, then started out touring and performing alongside his own bands, typically featuring Joe Farrell, Steve Grossman and others, making some groundbreaking albums like Putting It Together and Merry-Go-Round. In later years, he formed his own band, the Jazz Machine, featuring Joshua Redman, Nicholas Payton and Ravi Coltrane. So that was some insight into his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called Puttin' It Together, released in 1968. This was Elvin's debut for Blue Note Records. The performance featured an all-star band. There was Joe Farrell on tenor and soprano saxophone and flute, and Jimmy Garrison, his colleague from the classic Coltrane quartet, on double bass. Joe Farrell belts out some great solos on this album. Garrison is very innovative on double bass, and Elvin Jones pushes things along with some great drumming. Elvin was released in 1961. This one's a great compilation of straight-ahead jazz with a Count Basie style to it. It was recorded for Riverside Records. There's a diverse range of music, from a beautiful ballad called You Are Too Beautiful to an energetic song called Buzz Act. Some great sublime drumming by Elvin, and many critics have said this album was ahead of its time. And Remembrance, released in 1978, this is one of his best albums for Blue Note Records. He performs on this album alongside his band, the Jazz Machine. Many of the tunes in the album were original compositions that feature room for improvisation as they performed. Elvin completes the picture with some high-powered drumming. So that was a quick insight into everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan Silva. You can check out the archives of today's show on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So on that note, I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.